The spoon left my hand before I understood what had happened. One moment I was stirring the pot of soup I had simmered since before the sun came up, tasting it the way my mother taught me 70 years ago, with the side of the spoon touched softly to my lip. The next moment the spoon was in Madison's hand and my fingers were empty and warm from where she had gripped them too hard. She did not look at me. She looked at the pot, and then at the guests gathered in the open kitchen beyond the island, and then back at the pot, and she said in that bright, hostess voice she used when she wanted the room to hear her, "You ruin every meal, Margaret. Every single one. Go sit down before you embarrass us again." The guests stopped talking. Someone laughed, a small uncertain laugh, the kind people make when they are not sure if a thing is a joke. My son David was standing by the wine rack, pretending to read the label on a bottle he had chosen an hour earlier. He did not look up. He did not look up. That is the part one will remember longer than the spoon. Longer than the laugh, longer than the hot shame spreading from my throat down into my chest. My son did not look up. I wiped my hands on the kitchen towel that had been a gift from my late husband Henry the Christmas before he died, and I folded it once and set it on the counter. I smiled at Madison the way I had smiled at school board chairs and hospital administrators and rude hotel clerks for 50 years. I said, "Of course, dear." And I walked out of my own kitchen in my own house, past the table I had set with my own china, and I went to sit in the chair by the window where the light fell best. I was not shaking. I was not crying. I was calm. That is what most people misunderstand about a woman like me. They think silence is surrender. They do not know that silence is the sound a woman makes when she has already decided what she is going to do, and is only waiting for the right moment to do it. My name is Margaret Whitfield. I am 73 years old, and until that Sunday afternoon I had been cooking in this kitchen for 46 years. Henry and I bought the house in 1979 when David was 4 and his sister Rebecca was not yet born. It was a yellow two-story on a corner lot in a quiet street in a town outside Philadelphia where the elm trees were still young, and the neighbors still came to your door with pie. Henry was an engineer at the aerospace plant. I taught high school English for 31 years. We were not poor, but we were careful, the way people were then, and we saved and we planned. And when Henry's mother passed in 1983, she left us a small sum that we did not touch for 15 years because Henry always said, "Margie, a gift like that is not a thing to spend. It is a thing to let grow." He had a way of saying things that made them sound like they had already happened whether you agreed or not. I loved that about him. I loved many things about him. He died 11 years ago in the upstairs bedroom in the hospital bed we had rented, and I held his hand for the last hour of his life, and afterwards I walked down the stairs and I made a pot of tea and I drank it in the chair by the window, and I have not stopped sitting in that chair since. David moved back in after Henry died. Not right away. First he called often and came on Sundays and brought groceries I did not need because I could still drive, could still carry a bag, could still pick out a cantaloupe better than any man in a produce aisle. But then his marriage ended and his consulting business had what he called a transitional year, and the lease on his apartment was up and he said, "Mom, I think it makes sense for me to come stay with you a while. The house is too big for one person. I can help with things." I said yes because he was my son, and because I had raised him to know he always had a home with me, and because in the first year after Henry the first had learned that a house can hold more silence than a person can carry alone. So David came back and he stayed and the stay became a year and the year became 3, and then he met Madison at a wine tasting in the city and brought her home for dinner the way a boy of 13 brings a new friend to show his mother, and I knew the first night I met her that my life had just changed shape in a way I would not be able to undo easily. Madison was 38 years old and worked in what she called brand strategy. She was tall and thin and very well put together, the kind of woman whose hair always looked like she had just come from the salon, even on a Tuesday morning. She wore clothes that made small sounds when she moved, fabric that whispered. She smiled with her whole mouth but never with her eyes, and she called me Margaret from the first handshake, not Mrs. Whitfield, not even the hesitant mom that David's first wife had tried out like a shoe she was not sure she wanted to buy. Madison said Margaret the way a landlord says your name when he is reading it off a lease. She and David were married 9 months after they met, in a ceremony at a vineyard I was told about 2 weeks before the date. I wore a navy dress and sat at a round table with 3 of David's cousins I had not seen since Henry's funeral, and I watched my son marry a woman who already, I could tell, did not like me very much. She moved in 2 days after the honeymoon. Into my house. into the bedroom at the top of the stairs that Henry and I had shared for 36 years. I had moved out of it the year Henry died, because I could not sleep in that room without him, and I had taken the small room at the back of the house that used to be Rebecca's. That was fine. That was my choice. But when Madison arrived with her 7 matching suitcases and her shoe boxes stacked in tidy pillars in the foyer, she walked through the house the way a buyer walks through a property, and she said things like, "Oh, this will have to go. And we can open this wall. And Margaret, have you considered downsizing the knickknacks? They read very cluttered." David stood behind her smiling the apologetic smile of a man who had already decided, at some level below his own awareness, that peace in his house was going to cost him his spine. I did not say anything that first week. I have learned over 73 years that the first week of any arrangement is not the time to fight. You watch. You wait. You see what people do when they think you are too polite to notice. Madison, I discovered quickly, was the kind of woman who rearranged a kitchen in the middle of the night. I came down on the 4th morning to find my spice rack reorganized alphabetically and my good cast iron skillet, the one Henry gave me our first Christmas, sitting in a donation bag by the back door. I took it out of the bag. I put it back on the hook. I said nothing. 2 days later it was in the bag again. I took it out again. The 3rd time Madison came into the kitchen while I was retrieving it and she said, in that same bright voice, "Oh, Margaret, we're trying to streamline. That old thing must weigh 10 pounds. You'll hurt yourself." I looked at her. I said, "I've been cooking with this skillet since before you were born. I believe I'll keep it." She smiled her mouth smile. "Of course," she said. "It's your house." She said it the way people say a thing is yours when they are already planning how to take it. The cooking was the first battleground, and I should have seen that coming because the kitchen had always been where I lived. I cooked for David and Rebecca and Henry for 4 decades. I cooked for the high school English department on the last day of every school year. I cooked for the church bereavement committee. I cooked for neighbors recovering from surgery. I cooked because it was the language my mother taught me and her mother taught her, and because there is a particular quiet joy in feeding people you love, and even people you do not know, and even sometimes people you do not like. Henry used to say I cooked like a woman who had nothing to prove and everything to say. I did not know what he meant exactly, but I understood it the way a dog understands the tone of its person's voice. Madison did not cook. She assembled. She stood at the island with a cutting board and a very expensive knife, and she made salads from bagged greens and bowls from pre-cooked grains and platters of things that had come from the specialty market in little plastic tubs. She called it curating. She would say, "I'm curating a brunch for Saturday," the way a museum director announces a new exhibit. And because she did not cook, she had, I realized slowly, a complicated relationship with the fact that I did. At first she ignored my meals. Then she criticized them gently, the way you correct a child's grammar. "Margaret, this chicken is so heavy. Have you tried air frying?" "Margaret, I'm trying to keep David's sodium down. Could we do something simpler tomorrow?" "Margaret, the soup is fine, it's just a little, I don't know, beige. It reads beige." She would say these things in the kitchen with David standing 3 feet away, and David, who had eaten my cooking for 50 years and whose own mother I had been for that whole time, would nod vaguely and look at his phone and say nothing. That was when I began to understand, really understand, what had happened to my son. He had not married a woman who was difficult. He had married a woman who had given him permission to be someone easier. Someone who did not have to stand up for his mother because his wife had decided his mother was a problem. And David, who had been easy all his life, who had always taken the path that required the least of him, had accepted the permission the way a thirsty man accepts water. Then came the dinners. Madison loved to host. It was, I came to understand, the main expression of herself. She hosted brunches, she hosted dinners, she hosted what she called small intimate evenings that involved 12 people and a caterer. She would invite her work friends, David's college friends who had become her friends, the couple from down the street she had decided were important, her sister Kaylee who came up from Washington with her husband and their small loud dogs. For the first few months of her living in the house I had been asked, in a tone that left no room for refusal, to make yourself scarce on Saturday, Margaret, we're having people. And I would. I would drive to my friend Ruth's house in the next town over, or I would spend the day at the library, or I would go to the movies alone in the afternoon and come back after 9. I did not mind. I told myself I did not mind. But something happens to a woman my age, when she is asked to leave her own house so that her daughter-in-law can entertain in it. Something small and sharp enters the chest and does not leave. You file it away. You do not say anything. But it is there. I felt it every time. And then one Saturday Madison changed the rules. She came into my room on a Thursday evening, knocking first, which she rarely did, and she sat on the edge of my bed as if she were a friend and said, "Margaret, I had an idea. For Saturday night. We're having some really important people over, David's new client and his wife, and I thought, wouldn't it be lovely if you cooked? Your pot roast, the one David talks about. It would be such a warm touch. Give the whole evening that family feeling." I looked at her for a long moment. She smiled. Her eyes were flat. "Of course," I said. "I'd be happy to." What I did not say, because I had already learned not to say it, was that I understood exactly what she was doing. She had decided that my cooking was, in fact, good enough to serve to people she wanted to impress. But she did not want to say that. So she had framed it as a favor she was doing me, a chance to contribute, a way of including me. She wanted my pot roast. She did not want to admit she wanted it. I cooked the pot roast. I cooked it the way I had cooked it for Henry's birthdays and David's homecomings and Rebecca's graduation. I cooked it for 8 hours, and the kitchen smelled the way my mother's kitchen used to smell. And when Madison's guests arrived at 7 o'clock on Saturday evening, the first thing the wife of the client said when she walked in was, "Oh my God, what is that smell? It smells like Thanksgiving at my grandmother's house." Madison smiled and said, "We love to cook." And nobody corrected her, including me. That was the pattern for the next year. Madison would host. I would cook. Madison would receive the compliments. I would serve the plates, and then, often as not, I would be eased out of the room before dessert because Madison had the professional stuff to discuss, and did not want the evening to feel, and here I am quoting her directly, too multigenerational. David, when I raised it with him once in the car coming back from the grocery store, said, "Mom, she's just trying to make a good impression on her clients. It's not about you." I looked at him, my son, who had his father's nose and his father's hands, but not, it was turning out, his father's heart, and I said, "David, when a thing is not about me but is done to me, it is still done to me." He laughed a little nervous laugh and said, "You've always been dramatic." I have not, in fact, always been dramatic. I have been my whole life almost unreasonably calm. Henry used to say my calm was a kind of weather system that made birds fly backward. But my son did not remember that or chose not to, and I looked out the window at the trees going past and I thought, all right then. Now I know. Rebecca called once a month from Oregon, where she had moved for her husband's job 15 years ago, and had stayed because she had built a life there, and had 3 children and a veterinary practice and no particular interest in returning east. Rebecca and I talked about her children and about books and about the small weather of our days, and I did not tell her for a long time about Madison. I did not want to worry her. I did not want to be the kind of mother who complains long distance. But Rebecca is nobody's fool, and she had noticed on her one visit after the wedding that something was off, and finally one Tuesday evening in the fall she said, "Mom, tell me, what's happening in that house?" And I told her. Some of it, not all of it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You know you don't have to stay there, right? You own that house. You have options." I said, "I know, sweetheart." She said, "Mom, please don't let them forget whose house that is." I said, "I won't." After I hung up, I sat in the chair by the window for a long time and I thought about my daughter, and about the way a daughter far away sees a thing more clearly sometimes than a son right under your roof, and I felt something I had not felt in a while. Something like resolve. Not anger. Resolve is older than anger. It is what you have left when anger has been boiled down long enough. But I still did not act. That is the part one am not proud of. I want to tell you the truth. I watched for 2 more years. 2 years of meals cooked and meals criticized. 2 years of Madison rearranging my kitchen and my living room, taking down the framed photograph of Henry on the mantel because it reads a little heavy for the space, and replacing it with a print of a lemon. 2 years of David not looking up. 2 years of small remarks about my age, about my driving, about my hearing, about whether I should really be the one holding the good china because my hands, she had noticed, shake a little. My hands do not shake. My hands have never shaken. But Madison had begun to say that they did, and she had begun to say it to other people, And I had begun to notice a particular kind of smile on the faces of her friends when they looked at me. The smile you give an old woman you have already been told is confused. I was not confused. I was, if anything, becoming clearer every day. But I said nothing. I kept the peace, which is what women my age were taught to do, and what women of every age are told to do when a man's comfort is at stake. I was keeping my son's peace. I was keeping Madison's peace. I was not keeping my own. The Sunday of the spoon was in April, a bright cool day with the forsythia just starting to open in the front yard. Madison had decided a week earlier that we were going to have what she called a spring luncheon. 10 people. 2 of her colleagues, David's business partner and his wife, Madison's sister Kaylee, Kaylee's husband, and a couple from the neighborhood whose names I had heard maybe 3 times. Madison had done the flowers. Madison had done the table, setting out my china but in an arrangement she called modern, which meant she had put the salad forks on the wrong side. She had picked the wine. She had made a kale and pomegranate salad and a platter of cheeses from the specialty market. And she had asked me 3 days before to make the soup. Your tomato bisque, Margaret. Everyone asks about it. I made it Sunday morning starting at 6. San Marzanos from the good can, fresh basil I had grown on the kitchen windowsill because I refused to let Madison take the windowsill away from me, cream butter, a little sugar because Henry had taught me 40 years ago that the trick to tomato soup is admitting what tomatoes want. I had simmered it for hours. It was perfect. I know that it was perfect because I have made that soup 500 times, and I know it the way a pianist knows a piece of music. The guests arrived at 12:30. By 1 o'clock, the kitchen was full of people with glasses of wine. Madison was doing her hostess dance at the island, laughing brightly, arranging cheese. I was at the stove stirring the soup one last time. I was wearing a soft gray dress and the pearl earrings Henry gave me the year he retired. I had put on lipstick. I am telling you these things because later it mattered to me, when I thought about it, that I had dressed for the occasion. That I had been the version of myself I wanted to be. Madison turned from the island and walked over to the stove. She was wearing a cream-colored dress and her hair was loose and she had a smile on her face that the guests could all see. I was holding the wooden spoon. I lifted it for the last taste. And before the spoon reached my lip her hand closed around my wrist, firm, and took the spoon out of my hand. She took it. She did not ask. She did not wait. She lifted it out of my fingers the way you take a toy from a child who has played with it too long. And she said, loud enough for the 10 people in the kitchen to hear, "You ruin every meal, Margaret. Every single one. Go sit down before you embarrass us again." The kitchen went silent. I will tell you what I heard in that silence because it is important. I heard one woman laugh, the short, uncertain laugh I have already told you about. I heard a wine glass touch a counter. I heard the refrigerator cycling on. I heard Madison's sister Kaylee say very quietly, "Oh, Madison." The way you say a friend's name when they have gone too far and you are embarrassed for them. I heard my son David, clear his throat once and not speak. I looked at Madison. She had the spoon in her hand. She was smiling at the guests now, having already turned away from me, as if the matter were settled, as if I had already left the room in her mind and she was waiting for my body to catch up. And I felt something rise in me, something hot and sharp, something that wanted to take the pot off the stove and pour it on the floor, that wanted to tell her exactly what I thought of her in front of every person in my kitchen, that wanted to walk over to my son and slap him across his handsome cowardly face the way I had never slapped him when he was a child, even when he had deserved it. I felt all of that. And I let it rise and I let it stand and then I let it settle because I am 73 years old and I have learned in 73 years that the thing you do in the first 10 seconds after someone has humiliated you is the thing you will have to live with for the rest of your life. So I smiled. I wiped my hands on Henry's Christmas towel. I folded the towel and set it on the counter. I said, "Of course, dear." I walked out of the kitchen without hurrying. I walked past the dining room where Madison had set the table with my china. I walked past David, who I will tell you did not meet my eyes even when I was close enough to touch him. I walked into the living room and I sat down in the chair by the window, the chair Henry had picked out for me at an estate sale in 1986 because he said the light fell right on it at 4 in the afternoon, and I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and I looked out at the forsythia and I waited. I waited because I needed to let my heart slow down. I waited because I needed to decide. I have told you I had already been deciding for 2 years. That is true. But there is a difference between deciding and doing, and in that moment in the chair by the window I crossed the line from one to the other. In that moment I stopped being the woman who was living in her own house as a guest. I became the woman who owned the house. Madison came looking for me eventually. She came into the living room about 20 minutes later, after the guests had been seated, after she had served the soup, which I could hear her doing from the other room with her bright hostess voice, ladling it out while complimenting her own tomato bisque. I heard one of the women, I think the wife of David's business partner, say, "Oh my, this is extraordinary, Madison, you must give me the recipe." And I heard Madison say, "Oh, I'll try. It's really just intuition at this point." I was sitting very still in my chair. When Madison appeared in the doorway, she had her bright face on, the one she wore for company. "Margaret," she said, "we saved you a plate. Come on back in. Don't pout." I looked at her. I did not say anything for a long moment. She stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, the picture of a woman being gracious. Finally I said, "I'm not pouting, Madison. I'm sitting." She laughed a little. "Well, come sit at the table. Everyone's asking after you." I said, "No, thank you." She tilted her head. "Margaret, don't be difficult. We have guests." I said, "Madison, I am aware." She looked at me more closely. Something flickered on her face, the smallest thing, a flicker of the knowledge that she had perhaps misjudged the moment. She covered it with her smile. "Suit yourself," she said. "I'll bring you a tray later." She turned and went back to her lunch. I sat in the chair. The guests ate the soup. I heard them. I heard them all. I heard them eating soup I had made in my kitchen in my house, at a table I had been sent away from by a woman who did not pay a single dollar of the mortgage because there was no mortgage, because Henry and I had paid off the house in 2009. I sat there and I let the fact of it all settle through me like sediment through water. And when the water was clear, I stood up. I went upstairs. I went to my small bedroom at the back of the house, and I opened the bottom drawer of the bureau that had been my mother's, and I took out the envelope that had been sitting there for 14 months. The envelope contained 3 things. It contained a letter from my lawyer, Elaine Chan, confirming the details of the conversation we had had in her office the previous February. It contained a copy of the deed to the house, which was still, as it had been since 1979, in my name alone, because Henry and I had bought the house before we married. That is the thing nobody in that kitchen knew. David did not know. Madison did not know. The house had always been mine. Henry had never been on the deed. When he died, there was no transfer. There was nothing to transfer. The house was mine from the first day and had stayed mine every day since. The third thing in the envelope was a copy of my updated will. I had signed it 14 months earlier. It left the house to Rebecca. Not to David. To Rebecca. Elaine had drawn it up after a long conversation in which I had said, finally out loud, the thing I had been thinking for a year. I had told Elaine, "I love my son, but I do not trust him to protect what I leave him. I do not trust him to protect his sister's share. I do not trust him to protect me." Elaine, who is a sharp-eyed woman of 60 with grown children of her own, had not looked surprised. She had said, "Margaret, a will is not a gift. It is a statement. What do you want to say?" And I had told her. And she had written it down and I had signed it. I had told no one. Not David. Not Rebecca. Not even Ruth. It had been sitting in the drawer for 14 months the way a gun sits in a drawer. A thing you hope you will not need, a thing you keep nearby in case you do. I took the envelope out of the drawer. I put it on the bed. I sat down next to it. I thought for a long moment. I could hear the laughter from downstairs. The sound of Madison entertaining her guests in a house she did not own. And I thought about the thing Rebecca had said to me on the phone 2 years ago. Don't let them forget whose house that is. I had almost let them. I had almost, in my politeness and my patience and my desire not to make trouble, let them forget entirely. But the spoon had reminded me. The spoon had been the thing that reminded me. It is a strange thing how sometimes the smallest cruelty is the one that finally breaks the spell. I picked up my phone. I scrolled to Elaine Chen's number. I did not call yet. I looked at the number for a long time. Calling Elaine on a Sunday afternoon was something I had never done in all the years I had been her client. But Elaine had told me when she gave me her card, "Margaret, if you ever need me, weekend or otherwise, you call. I'll answer." I believed her. Elaine was the kind of woman who said things she meant. I pressed the button. She picked up on the third ring. Margaret, is everything all right? Her voice was alert, not annoyed. A Sunday voice with the weekend sharpness still in it. I said, Elaine. No. I think it is time for us to act. There was a small pause. Then she said, tell me what happened. I told her. I told her about the spoon and about Madison and about the 2 years and about the guests eating the soup. I told her the way I might tell a doctor the history of a symptom clearly, in order, without drama. When I was finished, she said, Margaret, do you want me to initiate the steps we discussed? I said yes. All of them. She said, I can have papers ready by Wednesday. Formal notice of non-tenancy. 30-day notice to vacate. It's your house, and they are living there at your invitation. That invitation can be withdrawn. Are you sure? I said, Elaine, I have been sure for 2 years. I just had not found the moment. I have found the moment. She said, all right, Margaret. I'll see you Tuesday morning. And Margaret. Yes, Elaine. Don't tell them anything yet. Let me do the work. It's cleaner that way. I said, I wasn't going to. She laughed a little, a dry, sharp laugh, and said, I know. That's why I'm going to win this for you. I hung up. I sat on the bed. I could hear the guests starting to stand up downstairs. Chairs scraping. Voices moving toward the door. The lunch was ending. The luncheon Madison had hosted in my dining room with my china had come to its gracious close. I heard Madison at the door saying her goodbyes, thanking people, kissing cheeks. I heard her sister Kaylee say to her quietly, Madison, that thing you said to Margaret was unkind. I heard Madison say, oh, she didn't mind. Margaret never minds anything. I heard Kaylee say, she minded. And then I heard the door close. I sat on the bed. I had to be careful now. I had to go back downstairs and be the Margaret I had been for 2 years. The Margaret who did not mind anything. The Margaret who drifted through her own house like a polite ghost. I had to be her for 30 more days. Because Elaine had said it cleaner that way, and Elaine was right. I went back downstairs. Madison was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher. She looked up when I came in. She had a glass of white wine in her hand. She said, there you are. I saved you a bowl of soup. It's on the counter. I looked at the bowl of soup she had saved me from a pot I had made. I said, thank you, Madison. She said, I hope you're not still upset about earlier. I was just under a lot of pressure. You know how it is when you're hosting. I said, I understand completely. She looked at me more closely the way she had upstairs. Something about my face was not quite what she expected, I think. She said, Margaret, are you all right? You look a little tired. I said, I am a little tired. I think I'll go to my room and rest. She said, of course. Oh, and Margaret, I put the wooden spoon back in the drawer. The one from earlier. I'm sorry I was short with you. I looked at her. I smiled. I said, that's all right, Madison. It's just a spoon. And I walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs and into my room, and I closed the door and I sat on the bed and I laughed. Not a bitter laugh. Not a vengeful laugh. Just a clear, quiet laugh. Because Madison had no idea. She had no idea. She thought the spoon was the end of it. A small moment of friction between 2 women sharing a kitchen. She did not know that the spoon had been the moment I had been waiting for, the specific clarifying moment that the 2 years of watching had been building toward. She did not know that I had already made the call. She did not know that Elaine Chun, who bills at $500 an hour and wins 60% of her cases, was already at home drafting papers. Madison thought I had gone to sit in my chair and pout. Madison thought my silence was surrender. Madison thought, as so many people have thought about women my age, that the lights were dim in the house of my mind. They were not dim. They had never been dim. They had only been turned low, the way a careful woman turns down the lamp when she has company, so that the company does not see what she is reading. But the lamp was on. It had always been on. And I had been reading for 2 years, the story of a woman who had been forgotten in her own home, and I had been waiting patiently for the chapter in which she remembered herself. That chapter had begun in the kitchen, at 1 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon in April, when a woman who did not own my spoon had reached out and taken it from my hand. And I had smiled and I had walked out, and I had sat in my chair and I had decided. And by Wednesday, Elaine would have the papers ready, and David and Madison would have 30 days. And in the meantime I would walk through my house the way I had been walking through it for 2 years, quiet, agreeable, invisible. But I would be counting. I would be counting every minute until the end of their comfort. I would be counting the way a woman at a bus stop counts her change because she knows exactly what she has, and exactly what she is going to buy with it. I heard David come up the stairs a little while later. He knocked on my door softly. I said, "Come in." He opened the door and stood in the doorway the way a boy of 10 stands in a doorway when he has done something wrong and is hoping his mother will not notice. He said, "Mom. About earlier." I waited. He said, "Madison didn't mean it the way it sounded. She's been really stressed." I waited. He said, "I hope you're not upset." I looked at my son. I looked at the man he had grown into. I saw in his face the boy he had been, the boy who used to crawl into my lap on the big green couch and ask me to read the same 3 books over and over. I saw the teenager who had broken his arm falling out of the maple tree in the backyard, and had cried into my shoulder in the emergency room. I saw the young man who had stood next to me at Henry's funeral, his arm around my waist, holding me up when I was sure I would fall. I saw all of that. And I saw also the man he had become. A man who would stand in a kitchen and watch his wife humiliate his mother and say nothing. A man who would come up the stairs afterward not to apologize but to smooth things over. A man who wanted my forgiveness without having earned it, because it was easier than facing what he had allowed. I did not hate him. I loved him still. I will always love him. But love, I had learned in the last 2 years, is not the same as protection. You can love a person very much and still decide to protect yourself from what they are doing to you. I said, "David, I'm not upset. Thank you for checking on me." He looked relieved. He said, "Okay, Mom. Love you." I said, "I love you too, sweetheart." And I did. I meant it. And also I thought, you have 30 days. You have 30 days to prove to me that you are still your father's son. You will not know you are on the clock. But the clock is running. He closed the door. I sat in the dark for a little while. Then I stood up and I turned on the lamp, and I took out a piece of stationery from the small writing desk Henry had bought me for our 25th anniversary, and I wrote a letter to Rebecca. I did not tell her everything. I told her that something had happened and that I was taking steps, and that I wanted her to know before anyone else did, because she had seen it 2 years ago when I had not been ready to see it, and because a mother owes her clear-eyed daughter the truth. I told her I loved her. I told her that if she wanted to come east in the coming months, she would be welcome, but she did not need to come. I could handle it. I told her that her father would have been proud of what I was about to do. I sealed the letter. I put a stamp on it. I put it in my purse to mail in the morning from the post office 2 towns over, because I did not want it to go out from the mailbox at the end of the driveway where Madison sometimes, I had noticed, flipped through the outgoing mail. And then I sat at the window again, and I watched the last of the afternoon light move across the forsythia, and I thought about soup and about spoons, and about the long quiet power of a woman who has finally decided to stop asking nicely. Monday morning came gray and cool. I got up at 6 the way I always do, and I made myself coffee in the small French press that Madison had tried twice to move into the basement because it didn't match the counter aesthetic, and I drank it standing at the kitchen window. The house was quiet. David and Madison slept until 9 on weekdays because David worked from home and Madison, I had come to understand, did not work very much at all. She had a job technically, but her days seemed to consist mostly of phone calls and yoga and what she called networking lunches. I had 2 hours before either of them came downstairs, and I had things to do. I put on my good coat and my walking shoes and I drove to the post office 2 towns over and I mailed Rebecca's letter. Then I drove to the diner on Route 9 and I ordered eggs and rye toast and I sat at the counter and ate slowly, watching the rain start against the windows, and I let myself feel, for the first time in 2 years, something that was not quite happiness but was adjacent to it. It was the feeling of a woman who has finally stopped swallowing her own voice. When I got home at 9:30, Madison was in the kitchen in her silk robe, pouring herself coffee from the pot I had made. She looked up and said, "Oh, Margaret, there you are. Did you go to church?" She said this even though I had not gone to church in 15 years and she knew it. She said it, I understood, because she needed to say something, and because asking me where I had been was a way of reminding herself and me that she expected to know. I smiled. I said, I took a drive. It was a nice morning for it. She said. David has a call at 10, so I told him I'd handle breakfast. I was going to do those egg white muffins from the market. Do you want one? I said. No thank you, I ate out. She said. Oh, well. And she turned back to the coffee, and I went up to my room and I took off my coat, and I sat at the writing desk and I made a list. The list had 3 columns. In the first column I wrote down everything in the house that belonged to Madison. It was a short column. A standing mixer. 3 pieces of art she had bought after the wedding. Her clothes. Her shoes. The cream leather chair in the den that she had insisted on replacing my old wingback with. Some kitchen appliances, the espresso machine, the fancy blender. Her sister Kaylee had given them a set of copper pots for the wedding that Madison had never actually used. In the second column I wrote down what belonged to David. Also a short column. His laptop. His clothes. The exercise bike in the basement. A small collection of books. A framed Eagles jersey that had belonged to his college roommate and had somehow migrated into our den. In the third column I wrote down what belonged to me. That column took up the rest of the page and spilled over onto a second sheet. The house. The land. Every piece of furniture on the ground floor except Madison's chair. All of the kitchen except the appliances on her list. The dining room set. The china. The silver. The linens. The photographs. The books in the living room. The rugs. The piano nobody played anymore. Henry's tools in the garage. The garden. The 2 cars because both were in my name. Even, technically, the groceries in the refrigerator because I paid for most of them. I looked at the 3 columns. I looked at them for a long time. And I thought about how a person could live somewhere for 3 years as Madison had, and accumulate so little of what the house actually was. It was, I thought, an interesting way to measure a marriage. Not by what 2 people build together, but by what one of them has failed to build because she was living in a house someone else had already built, and she had mistaken living there for owning it. At 10:30 on Tuesday morning I drove into the city and met Elaine Chan at her office on the 14th floor of a building that looked out over the river. Elaine is a small woman with short gray hair and sharp eyes behind round glasses, and she shook my hand firmly and sat me down in the chair across from her desk and poured me tea from a thermos she kept on a side table. Margaret, she said, I want to walk you through what I've drafted. I want you to be certain. Once we serve the notice, we cannot unserve it. You can always choose to rescind, but that's a different thing and it sends a signal. I don't want you to send a signal you don't mean. I said, Elaine, I will not rescind. She looked at me over her glasses for a long moment. Then she nodded and she picked up the folder. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a formal letter from Elaine on her firm's letterhead, addressed to David Whitfield and Madison Whitfield, notifying them that they were occupying the property at 412 Chestnut Street as guests of the owner, Margaret Whitfield, and that the owner was withdrawing that hospitality effective 30 days from the date of the letter. The language was polite. The language was also very clear. You are not tenants, Elaine had written. There is no lease. You have no legal claim to residency. You are being asked as adult family members to vacate the premises within 30 days. The owner reserves all rights. The second document was a copy of the deed, attached as supporting material, showing that the property had been in my name since 1979 and had never been transferred. The third document was a letter I had asked Elaine to prepare separately, addressed only to David, not to Madison. I wanted my son to have a private moment with the truth, a chance to read it alone, before Madison got her hands on it. In that letter I had written, with Elaine's help, 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said I loved him. The second paragraph said that I had watched him, for 2 years, allow his wife to treat me in ways his father would have been ashamed of, and that I had decided I would no longer live under a roof where my son did not defend me. The third paragraph said that I hoped very much that he would use the 30 days to think hard about the man he had become, and that if he did, there might be a way forward for us, but that the way forward did not include him returning to this house. This house is mine, I had written. It was mine before you were born, and it will be mine after I am gone. What happens to it after I am gone is not your concern, David. Your concern is what you do in the time you have with me. Use the 30 days, David. Use them well. Elaine watched me read it. She said, Are you sure about that last letter, Margaret? I said, I am. She said, It's going to hurt him. I said, Elaine, he has hurt me for 2 years. He will survive being hurt for one afternoon. She nodded. She said, all right. I'll have the notice served Thursday morning by courier. The courier will hand it to David. Madison can read it after he does. Or not. That's up to him. I said, Thursday. She said, Thursday at 9 a.m. I'd recommend you be out of the house when it happens. Take a drive. Go have lunch with Ruth. You do not want to be in the building when he opens that envelope. I said, that is very wise. She smiled her small tight lawyer's smile. Margaret, I have done this more times than you would believe. The children, the adult children, they always want to argue with the mother in the first hour. Don't give them the first hour. Let them have it out with themselves first. I said, Elaine, you are worth every dollar. She said, I know. I drove home on Tuesday afternoon with a calm I had not felt in a very long time. The kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly what is about to happen, and knowing you are the one making it happen. Madison was out. David was in his office on a call. I went to my room and I began very quietly to pack. Not everything. Just the things I wanted to make sure I had on my own terms if things went badly. My mother's Bible. The small leather box of Henry's things, his wedding ring, his glasses, the letters he had written me in 1968 when we were dating and he was doing a 2-month engineering rotation in Seattle. My jewelry, most of which was costume but some of which was my grandmother's and was old enough to matter. A photograph album. A few books. I packed these things into a small suitcase and I slid the suitcase under my bed. I did not, you understand, intend to leave. I intended very much to stay. But I have learned in 73 years that a woman who is about to make a bold move should always know where her essential things are. You do not pack because you expect to run. You pack because preparation is a form of respect for your own future. On Wednesday I made a meatloaf. I want to tell you about the meatloaf because it matters. It was an ordinary Wednesday and I had no reason to make a special dinner, except that I knew what was coming on Thursday, and I wanted to give my son one more meal of the kind his mother used to make, because whatever he did with the notice, I wanted him to remember in years to come that the last dinner in his mother's house had been a good one. I made the meatloaf the way my mother made it. Ground beef and ground pork, onions softened in butter, a little oatmeal instead of breadcrumbs because that is what we used when Henry was small and I had kept the habit. I made mashed potatoes with the russets I had picked out at the market myself. I made green beans with almonds. I made a small side of applesauce because David had always liked applesauce with meatloaf, a thing he had learned from his father, who had learned it from his father, who had been a dairy farmer in Pennsylvania and who had believed all his life that applesauce improved almost anything. I set the table in the dining room with my good placemats but not the china. I used the everyday dishes. I lit one candle. I did not tell Madison or David anything about the next day, of course. I just made dinner. David came down at 6:30. He looked at the table and he looked at me and he said, Mom, is there an occasion? I said, no, sweetheart. I just felt like making dinner. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Something moved across his face, something I could not quite read. He said, it smells like when I was a kid. I said, it is like when you were a kid. Madison came down then in workout clothes. She looked at the table and she said, oh my God, Margaret, this is so sweet. Is it a Wednesday thing? Are we doing a Wednesday thing now? I said, I just made dinner. We sat down. Madison ate very little. She pushed her mashed potatoes around and said things about carbs. She made one comment about the meatloaf that I will not repeat because I do not want to give it space in this story. David ate. He ate quietly and he ate all of it, and at one point he reached for the applesauce without thinking and he put a spoonful on his plate next to the meatloaf and I watched him do it and I thought, there you are. There is the boy I raised. He is still in there somewhere. He has been buried under this man for a long time but he is not gone. Whether he comes back in the next 30 days or ever is not up to me. But he is not gone. After dinner I cleared the plates. Madison went to take a shower. David stayed at the table for a moment and then he said, Mom, thank you. That was really good. I said, you're welcome, David. He said, I love you, Mom. I said, I love you too. And I meant it, and he meant it. And also by 9 o'clock the next morning a courier would be knocking on his door with an envelope, and he did not know. Thursday morning I left the house at 8:30. I told Madison I was going to Ruth's for the day. Madison was on her laptop at the kitchen island in her silk robe. She barely looked up. She said, "Have fun, Margaret." I said, "Thank you, dear." David was already in his office, door closed, on an early call. I did not say goodbye to him. I did not trust myself to say goodbye to him on that particular morning without something showing in my face. I drove to Ruth's. Ruth is my oldest friend, the person I have known since 1971, when we were both new teachers at the same high school and had bonded over a terrible principal and a worse cafeteria. Ruth is 81 now and walks with a cane and has a mind like a steel trap. I had told her 2 weeks earlier what I was planning. Ruth had said, "Finally, Margaret. Finally." She was the only person I had told. Not even Rebecca knew the specific day. Ruth had made scones and had coffee ready when I arrived, and we sat at her kitchen table and we did not talk about the envelope being delivered at 9 o'clock 3 towns away. We talked about her grandson who had just started medical school, and about a book she was reading, and about the question of whether her daughter's husband was going to finally leave that terrible job, and I realized about an hour in exactly what I needed. Ruth was giving me the gift of an ordinary morning at a moment when my life was anything but ordinary. My phone rang at 9:43. It was David. I let it ring. It rang again at 9:45. I let it ring. At 9:47 it rang a third time and then a text came through. "Mom, please call me. There's a man at the door with a letter from a lawyer." "Mom, what is going on?" I looked at Ruth. Ruth said, "He's faster than I thought." I said, "He always was good at tests." I texted David back. "David, I am with Ruth. I will be home this afternoon. Please read the letter and do not respond to me until you have read it all the way through. We will talk when I come home." I put the phone down. It rang again almost immediately. I did not answer. At 9:52 a text came through from Madison. It said, "Margaret, what have you done?" I did not answer that either. At 10:15 another text from David. "Mom, I read it. I need to talk to you. Please." I did not answer. At 10:30 another text from Madison. This one was longer. It said, "Margaret, this is absolutely outrageous. We are family. You cannot do this to us. David is your son. I am your daughter-in-law. We live here. You cannot just throw us out like this. I don't know what you think you are doing, but we need to sit down and have a civilized conversation about this. Call me back. Call David back. This is insane." I read that text twice. I thought about how the word family works for some people. How it is a word they use when they want something from you, and a word they forget when they want to be free of you. I did not answer. I put the phone face down on Ruth's table. Ruth said, "Another scone?" I said, "Yes, please." I went home at 3:30. I wanted them to have the day. I wanted them to sit with it. I wanted Madison to have enough time to cycle through her first reactions and arrive, I suspected, at the version of the reaction she had decided was most strategic. I was not wrong. When I walked into my house at 3:35, David was sitting at the kitchen island and Madison was standing behind him with her hand on his shoulder, and the moment I came through the door Madison said, before I had even taken my coat off, "Margaret, we've talked, and we think there's been a terrible misunderstanding." I said, "Hello, Madison." "Hello, David." David said, "Mom." He looked at me. He had been crying, I could see. Not recently. A while ago. His eyes were red around the edges. Madison said, "Margaret, come sit down. Let's talk about this like adults." I hung up my coat. I walked into the kitchen. I did not sit down. I leaned against the counter across from them. I said, "All right. Talk." Madison drew a breath. She had, I could see, prepared her approach. Her voice was softer than usual. Warmer. She said, "Margaret, we understand that we have not been perfect house guests. And we are so sorry if anything we did made you feel disrespected. But Margaret, honey, this letter. This is such a huge overreaction. If you were upset about Sunday, we can talk about Sunday. David and I are happy to talk about anything. But we can't just uproot our whole life over a misunderstanding about a spoon." She said this last word with a small laugh, as if the spoon were so trivial that my having reacted to it was, itself, evidence of how unreasonable I had become. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "Madison, you are not a house guest. A house guest is a person I invited for a weekend. You have lived in my house for 3 years. She said, Margaret, you know what I mean. I said, I know exactly what you mean. That is the problem. David said, Mom, please, sit down. I said, David, I am going to stand. I am going to say a few things and then I am going to go to my room, and tomorrow we will have a conversation about logistics. Tonight is not for logistics. They looked at me. David nodded. Madison did not. I went on. I said, the letter was not about the spoon. The letter was about the 2 years. The letter was about every meal I cooked that you took credit for, Madison. The letter was about every time you moved my things. The letter was about my husband's picture being taken off the mantel and replaced with a print of a lemon. The letter was about being told my hands shake when my hands do not shake. The letter was about the fact that my own son has not met my eyes in a room where his wife was insulting me for 2 years. The letter is not an overreaction, Madison. The letter is the first proportionate reaction I have had in 3 years. Every other reaction has been too small. This one is the right size. Madison's face had gone through several colors in that short speech. By the end of it, it was the color of cold tea. She said, Margaret, I resent the implication. I said, Madison, I am past caring what you resent. She said, David, are you going to let her speak to me this way? David looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment. And then he looked at me. And then for the first time in more than 2 years, my son did the thing I had been waiting for him to do. He said, Madison, stop. Madison turned to him. David. He said, Madison, please. Let her finish. She is right. I will tell you that in that moment I almost put my hand on the counter to steady myself, because I had not known until it happened how much I had wanted to hear him say those 3 words. Madison stared at him. She said, David, you cannot be serious. He said, I have never been more serious. She said, she is throwing us out of our house. He said, Madison, it is not our house. It has never been our house. It is her house. We have been living in her house. I should have been more clear about that from the beginning. Madison opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. She said, I am going to our room. David said, okay. She walked out of the kitchen. I heard her climb the stairs. I heard the bedroom door close, not slam, close deliberately, the way a woman closes a door when she is still trying to hold the shape of her dignity. David put his head in his hands. He was quiet for a long time. I stood across the counter from him. I did not go to him. I wanted to. You do not know, if you have not been a mother for 50 years, how hard it is to watch your son put his head in his hands and not go to him. But I did not go. Because he had not earned that yet. He had earned 2 words, Madison, stop. He had not earned my coming around the counter. Not yet. Finally he looked up. He said, Mom. I said, yes. He said, I am so sorry. I said, tell me more. He said, I don't know where to start. I said, start with 2 years ago, David. Start with the first time she said something to me in front of you, and you did not correct her. He said, Mom, He stopped. He started again. He said, I knew. I knew the whole time. I knew and I did nothing. I kept telling myself it was a phase, or she was stressed, or you were tough, you could handle it. I made every excuse a man can make when he is a coward. I did not say anything to that. I let him have it. I let it sit in the air. He kept going. I love her, Mom. I do. But I have been afraid of her. I have been afraid of her temper. I have been afraid of what she would do if I pushed back. So I did not push back, and I let her do whatever she wanted, and I pretended it was peace. And it was not peace. It was you, Mom, bearing the cost of my peace. That's what it was. I said, yes, David. That is what it was. He put his head back in his hands. After a minute he said, what do I do? I said, David, you are 49 years old. I am not going to tell you what to do. He said, Mom. I said, but I will tell you this. You have 30 days. In 30 days you and Madison will not be living in my house. Where you live and whether you live with her and what you do with the rest of your life is not my problem to solve. It is yours. I will say one thing more, David, and then I am going to go to my room. The thing I will say is that your father would have stopped her on the very first day. The first time she took a knick-knack off the mantel. Your father would have said, in his quiet way, Madison, that stays where it is. And she would have left it there because she would have understood from his tone that he meant it. You have his nose, David, and you have his hands, but you have been living without his spine for 2 years, and I have noticed, and I have been waiting for you to find it. It is not too late to find it, David, but it is too late for me to wait any longer. I have done the waiting a mother is supposed to do. You have to do the rest yourself. He nodded. He did not speak. I left the kitchen and went upstairs. I heard them later that night. I did not listen on purpose, but I heard voices low and urgent from their room. I heard Madison cry once. I heard David speak calmly over and over, the way you speak to a person when you have made up your mind and they have not yet realized that you have. I slept better that night than I had slept in 2 years. Not because I was enjoying their pain. I want you to understand that. I did not enjoy it. It was not what I wanted. What I wanted was to be respected in my own house, and what I had finally accepted after 2 years was that respect was not coming from them, and that I had to take it for myself because nobody was going to give it to me as a gift. That realization is not triumph. It is grief. It is the particular grief of a woman who has finally understood that her son cannot protect her the way her husband did, because her son is not her husband, and because she had not, after all, raised him as well as she thought she had. I slept, but I did not sleep happily. I slept the way a woman sleeps when she has finally stopped fighting a losing argument with her own hope. The next morning Madison had packed 2 suitcases. She came downstairs at 7:30, dressed for travel, her hair perfect, her face composed. She said, I am going to my sister's in Washington for a week. David and I need some space. I looked at David. He was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He nodded slightly. I understood that they had decided this together, or that at least David had agreed to it. I said, all right, Madison. Have a safe trip. She looked at me. She said, Margaret. I said, yes, Madison. She said, I want you to know that I do not believe I deserved this. I said, I believe you, Madison. That is part of the problem. She looked at me for a long second. Then she picked up her suitcases and walked out to the taxi that was waiting in the driveway. She did not hug David. She did not say goodbye to him. She got in the taxi and the taxi drove away. And David and I stood in the kitchen looking at the empty driveway. He said, Mom. I said, David. He said, I don't think she is coming back. I said, no. I don't think she is either. He said, I don't know what to do about that. I said, David, you will figure it out. You have 30 days. He did not leave with her. That surprised me. I had expected that when it came to a choice between his wife and his mother, he would go with his wife. That is the ordinary thing. That is what grown sons do usually, and I would not have blamed him for it, or I would have, but I would have understood it. Instead he stayed. He stayed the full 30 days, and during those 30 days something happened that I had not predicted, and that I want to tell you about carefully because it is the part of the story that people will want to misunderstand. My son, for the first time in more than 15 years, became my son again. He got up in the morning and he made coffee for both of us. He asked me how I had slept. He asked me what I was planning to do that day. He offered, the first weekend, to go to the hardware store and fix the back porch railing that had been loose since before Madison arrived. The railing that he had walked past for 3 years without noticing. He fixed it. He fixed the leaking faucet in the upstairs bathroom. He cleaned out the gutters. One afternoon I came home from Ruth's and found him sitting on the floor of the living room with a cardboard box in front of him, going through old photographs. He held one up when I came in. It was a picture of him at 8 years old, sitting on Henry's shoulders at a baseball game. He said, Mom, I hadn't looked at this in years. I sat down on the couch. He said, I miss him, Mom. I said, I know, sweetheart. So do I. We talked over those 30 days more than we had talked in 15 years. We talked about Henry. We talked about Rebecca, and about the small wounded place in David where he had always felt that his sister had gotten more of his father's attention, even though this was not true. We talked about his first marriage, which had ended because, he admitted to me one evening, he had not known how to be honest with his first wife about what he wanted. We talked about Madison. He talked about her with a kind of thoughtful sadness I had not heard from him before. He said one night, sitting on the back porch with a beer, "Mom, I think I married her because she knew what she wanted, and I didn't. And it was restful for a while to be with someone who was sure. And then I realized that she was sure about me in a way I did not actually want to be. She had decided who I was going to be, and I let her decide because it was easier. And then I looked up one day and I was a man who stood in a kitchen and watched his wife insult his mother. And I did not know how I had become that man. But I had. I said, David, you became that man because you wanted to be comfortable more than you wanted to be good. Most men do eventually. The good ones catch themselves. I hope you are catching yourself in time." He said, "Me too." Madison called him every day for the first week. Then every other day. Then once a week. I could hear him on the phone with her in his office, his voice tired. He did not go to Washington. She did not come back. On the 15th day he told me he had contacted a divorce lawyer. He said it at breakfast over the toast I had made. And he said it the way a man says a thing he has been rehearsing in his head for several days before saying it out loud. I said, "David, I am not going to tell you I am happy about that, because a mother is not supposed to be happy about her son's marriage ending. But I will tell you that I respect the decision if it is yours." He said, "It is mine." I said, "Then I respect it." He said, "Mom, I think I need to not be anyone's husband for a while. I think I need to be just myself for a while, and see who I am when there is no woman telling me what to do. First Emily, then Madison, and in between I lived with you, which was also someone telling me what to do. And I am 49 years old and I do not know truly who I am when I am alone." I said, "Then find out, David. That is a worthy project." He said, "Where should I go, Mom?" I said, "David, you are not asking me where you should go. You are asking me if I will tell you to stay. I will not tell you to stay. You have 30 days as I told you. This house is mine. You are going to find your own life and I am going to live in my own house, and we are going to see each other like adults who have chosen to see each other, not like a grown man and his mother living under the same roof because neither of them had the courage to arrange it differently. That is my gift to you, David. I am forcing you out of this house because it is the only way you will ever become the man your father hoped you would be." He cried then. He did not know I was going to say it that way. I had not known I was going to say it that way. But it came out and it was right, and he cried, and I held his hand across the table the way I had held his hand when he was 6 years old and had a fever. I held it for a long time. On day 22 he told me he had found an apartment. A small one in the city close to his office. He had signed a 6-month lease. He said, "Mom, a 6-month lease because I want to see what the next 6 months look like. And I do not want to assume anything about what comes after." I said, "David, that is wise." He said, "I am going to tell Madison tomorrow. She is going to be furious." I said, "She is going to be furious, yes. But you are not going to stay married to a woman out of fear of her fury. David, a marriage ended by one person's fear is a marriage that was already over." He said, "I know, Mom. I know." On day 25 Madison showed up. I had known she would. She showed up in a rental car on a Saturday afternoon, and she had on the same cream dress she had worn to the Sunday luncheon of the Spoon, which I noticed and which I took as deliberate. She came to the front door and knocked, which was itself a choice, because for 3 years she had used her key. I opened the door. She said, "Margaret, may I come in?" I said, "Of course, Madison." She came into the living room. David came down the stairs. He had known she was coming. They sat together on the couch, not touching. I sat in my chair, the chair by the window, the chair Henry had picked out for me in 1986. Madison looked at me and she said, "Margaret, I would like to speak with my husband privately." I looked at David. David said, "Madison, whatever you have to say, you can say in front of my mother." Madison's mouth tightened. She said, "David." He said, "Madison." She took a breath. She said, All right, David. I am here to tell you that I am willing to come back and try to work things out. But there will need to be some boundaries in place. I am not willing to live in a house where your mother treats me the way she has been treating me." I almost laughed. I did not. I kept my face still. David said, "Madison, my mother is not the issue. She has never been the issue. You are the issue. And I am the issue. We are the issue, Madison. And I do not think we can fix it. She said, David, you cannot be serious. He said, I have never been more serious. She said, what about everything we have built? He said, Madison, what have we built? I want you to think about that question honestly. In 3 years, what have we built together? We have hosted some parties. We have bought some things. We have eaten at some restaurants. We have taken 2 vacations, and one of them was to your sisters in Washington, which you cannot really count. We have not built anything, Madison. We have occupied my mother's house and we have called that a marriage. And it was not a marriage. It was a performance. And I was performing along with you for a long time because I did not know what else to do. But I am not going to perform anymore. Madison's face went through several things. Fury first. Then disbelief. Then a kind of cold settling, the face of a woman who is realizing that the negotiation is not going the way she had planned, and is recalculating. She said, so this is about her. She did not gesture at me, but she meant me. David said, Madison, look at me. I am going to say this once because my mother is sitting here, and I want her to hear me say it. This is about me. I have spent 2 years watching my wife mistreat my mother in her own home, and I did nothing. The problem was never my mother. The problem was me. The problem was that I married a woman who asked me to choose between my spine and my comfort, and I chose comfort and I blamed my mother for the cost of it. I am not doing that anymore. I am done. Madison looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Her face changed when she looked at me. It became briefly something ugly. She said, you think you have won something. I did not answer her immediately. I looked at her. I looked at this woman who had reached into my kitchen and taken a spoon out of my hand. I thought about the 67 ways, small and large, she had made my life in my own house harder over 3 years. I thought about the photograph of Henry, about the cast iron skillet, about the lemon print. I thought about all of it. And I said very quietly, Madison, I have not won anything. I have recovered something. There is a difference. She stood up. She said, David, when you are ready to talk to me like an adult, call me. She walked to the door. She stopped at the door. She turned back. She said, I hope you know what you are throwing away. David said, Madison, I know exactly what I am throwing away. That is why I am throwing it away. She left. We heard the rental car start up and pull out of the driveway. David sat on the couch. He put his face in his hands. I went over to him. I sat down next to him. I put my arm around his shoulders the way I had when he was a boy. I did not say anything. He did not say anything. We sat like that for a long time. Eventually he said, Mom. I said, Yes, David. He said, Thank you. I said, For what, sweetheart? He said, For not letting me disappear. I said, David, that has always been my job. I just forgot how to do it for a little while. We both forgot, I think, for a little while. But we remembered. On day 30, which was a Tuesday, David moved out. He did not take much. His clothes, his laptop, his bike, a few books, the Eagles jersey he had hung on to for 20 years. He left the exercise machine for the next tenant of the apartment he was moving to, which I thought was wise, because he had not used it in 3 years anyway. I watched him load his car in the driveway. He was wearing a pair of old jeans and a sweatshirt from the college he had gone to, and he looked, for the first time in a long time, like a man who had remembered how to dress himself. When he was ready to leave, he came up to me on the front porch. He said, Mom. I said, David. He said, I am going to come for dinner on Sunday, if that is all right. I said, David, Sunday dinner is a thing we do. It has always been a thing we do. Yes, come for Sunday dinner. He hugged me. He hugged me for a long time. Then he got in his car. He drove down the driveway. He turned left onto the street. He drove away. I stood on the porch. I looked at the forsythia, which had fully bloomed now, yellow and bright along the front walk. I looked at the house, my house. I went inside. I closed the door behind me. I stood in the front hall for a moment. The house was quiet. It was quieter than it had been in 3 years. It was, I realized, the quiet I had been trying to hear for a very long time. I walked through the downstairs. I walked into the kitchen. The wooden spoon was in the drawer where Madison had put it back the afternoon of the luncheon. I took it out of the drawer. I hung it on the little hook on the side of the stove, the hook Henry had installed in 1991, the hook where it had always lived until Madison had decided it was untidy. I hung the spoon on its hook. I stepped back. I looked at it. Thought there is a spoon that is exactly where it belongs. Then I went into the living room and I took down the print of the lemon and I put the print in the hall closet, and I went to the cabinet where I had put Henry's photograph 2 years ago when Madison had taken it down from the mantel, and I took it out of the cabinet and I put it back on the mantel in the middle where it had always been. I stood in front of the mantel. I looked at Henry's face. I said, "We are home, Henry. We are home." The first week alone in my own house was strange. I want to tell you that honestly because I think when people tell stories like mine they sometimes skip the part where, after the long-awaited freedom arrives, a woman has to sit with it and figure out what to do with her own afternoons. Freedom is not a feeling. Freedom is a room you have to furnish. And I had 3 years of habits to unlearn. Habits of smallness I had developed without noticing. I caught myself the first few mornings making coffee in quantities that made no sense for one person. I caught myself waiting at the kitchen counter for Madison to come down and pass judgment on whatever I was eating. I caught myself on the second evening lowering the volume on the television when a scene became loud, because for 3 years I had been lowering the volume to keep from disturbing anyone. There was nobody to disturb. The house was mine. I turned the volume back up. I watched the movie the way I wanted to watch it. I ate cheese and crackers for dinner because I did not feel like cooking, and no one looked at me sideways for having cheese and crackers for dinner, and I felt at the small table by the window with a glass of wine and a book, more like a person than I had in a very long time. Rebecca called on Thursday of the first week. She had received my letter. She had read it twice, she told me, and then she had read it to her husband, and then she had cried, and then she had laughed, and then she had called. She said, Mom, I am so proud of you." I said, "Thank you, sweetheart." She said, "How is David?" I said, "David is learning. He is 30 years behind schedule, but he is learning." She laughed. She said, "Can I come visit?" "I want to come visit. The boys have a break in June. Can I bring them?" I said, "Rebecca, my house is my house again, and yes, you may come, and yes, you may bring my grandsons. I will make up the 2 back bedrooms. I will clean the house from top to bottom. I will cook for you the way I used to cook when your father was alive, and we will have a real summer together. Come. Come for as long as you like." She said, "Mom, I am so happy." I said, "I am too, sweetheart. I did not know until I heard your voice just now how happy I am. I think I am going to cry." She said, "Cry, Mom. You have earned it." I cried. I cried on the phone with my daughter standing at my kitchen window with the sun on the counter, and it was the first time I had cried about any of this since the spoon, and it was a good cry, a releasing cry, the kind of cry that tells a woman her body has finally caught up with her decisions. David came for Sunday dinner. I made a roast chicken because I wanted to. I made it with lemon and thyme and a great deal of butter, and I did not apologize for any of it. David arrived at 4:30 with a bottle of wine and a small potted plant, a little pot of basil, which he handed to me in the front hall. He said, "Mom, I know you grow your own, but I saw this at the market and I thought she'll use it." I took the basil. I put it on the windowsill next to the one I had already been growing. They sat together, my old basil and the new basil David had brought me, and the sight of them made me happier than I had expected. David looked thinner. He looked tired, but his shoulders were lower than they had been in years. He walked through the house differently. He looked at things. He noticed. He said, "Mom, I had forgotten how the light in this living room falls in the afternoon." I said, "That is because for 3 years you walked through it without looking." He said, "Yes, I know. I am trying to relearn how to look." We ate at the dining room table, not in the kitchen because I wanted to use the table. I lit 2 candles. I used the china. David noticed and he said, "Mom, are we having an occasion?" I said, "Yes, David, we are. The occasion is that this is my house and you are my guest, and I wanted to set the table properly for my son who has come to have dinner with his mother." He filed the divorce papers on the 6th week after he moved out. Madison, I learned from David, had initially decided to fight. She had hired a lawyer of her own and had gone through a month of posturing and threats. But there was in the end not much to fight over. They had no children. They had no shared property of significance. The house had never been hers. David had not been foolish enough to put her name on his retirement accounts. She had come into the marriage with her own money, such as it was, and she would leave with it. The lawyer she had hired, David said, had told her within 2 meetings that there was no winning strategy, only the strategy of making David miserable for as long as possible before accepting the inevitable. Madison had chosen the misery strategy for a while, and then about halfway through she had apparently tired of it, because it is hard to sustain misery as a tactic when the person you are trying to hurt has stopped responding to you. The divorce was finalized in August. David told me on a Wednesday evening in a phone call that lasted about 3 minutes. He said, "Mom, it's done." I said, "David, how are you?" He said, "I am relieved. And I am sad. And I am relieved." I said, "Yes. That is the right set of feelings." He said, "I am going to come for dinner on Sunday." I said, "David, Sunday dinner is always a thing, as I have told you." He laughed. "Yes, Mom. I know." Rebecca came in June as she had promised, with her 2 boys, who were 12 and 14 and had grown so much since I had seen them last that I could not quite place them for the first half hour. They stayed for 3 weeks. It was the best 3 weeks I had spent in my house since Henry died. The house was full again, but it was full with the right people, and that made all the difference. Rebecca cooked with me. She had become a better cook than I was, I realized, over the years, and she had a way of reading a recipe that was just like Henry's, careful and curious at the same time. She taught me a few things. She taught me a Korean stew she had learned from a neighbor in Portland. She taught me to make my own tortillas, which I had always been intimidated by. The boys helped in the garden. They played gin rummy with me in the evenings. The older one, Jacob, was quiet and bookish and asked me one afternoon out of nowhere, "Grandma, what was Grandpa Henry like?" I sat down with him on the porch and I told him. I told him things I had not told David in 30 years. I told him about the way Henry laughed, which was quiet and slow, like a stream finding its way around a rock. I told him about the way Henry had proposed to me, which was not romantic by modern standards but was so perfectly Henry that I had said yes before he had finished the sentence. Jacob listened the whole time. He said at the end, "I wish I had known him." I said, "He would have loved you, Jacob. He would have told you all the things you are asking me. He would have wanted to know everything about you. I am glad you are asking me about him. I will tell you as much as you want to know, for as long as you want to hear it." He hugged me. He was 14 and he hugged me. I was surprised and grateful, and I did not let go for a little longer than I should have, and he let me. David came to dinner twice while Rebecca was there. The first time it was awkward. He and Rebecca had not seen each other in 2 years, and the last time they had seen each other, Madison had made a comment about Rebecca's clothes that Rebecca had never forgotten and probably never would. David knew it. Rebecca knew it. They sat at the table and they were polite. I let it be polite. I did not try to force them. But by the second dinner, which was toward the end of Rebecca's visit, something had shifted. David had apologized to Rebecca privately, I learned later. He had called her one afternoon when she was out on a walk and he had said some things and Rebecca had listened, and they had talked for more than an hour. I did not ask either of them what was said. I did not need to know. The second dinner they were themselves with each other. They told stories about their childhood. They argued about whether the blizzard of 1996 had been as bad as we all remembered. Rebecca's boys listened to their uncle the way boys listen to men they are deciding whether to respect. David noticed I could see that he was being weighed, and he rose to the occasion. He asked the boys about their lives. He listened to their answers. He did not talk about himself too much. When Rebecca left at the end of June, she and David hugged in the driveway, and Rebecca cried a little and David cried a little, and I stood on the porch and I thought, Henry, I wish you could see this. I know that is a thing people say and that it is usually a cliché, but I said it in my head standing there, and I meant it, and I felt him beside me on that porch, the way I sometimes still do. The way widows understand and other people do not. The summer went. The fall came. In October, David started seeing a therapist. He told me about it with the same quiet, slight embarrassment with which men of his generation tell their mothers about such things. As if it were still, in 2024, a small shameful act. I said, David, your father would have said, good. He would have said, about time, son. He would have said, every man should have someone to talk to besides his wife and his mother. David said, really? I said, yes, David, really. You did not know your father as well as you thought you did. He was more thoughtful about these things than he let on. David said, Mom, I am learning that I did not know my father as well as I thought I did. And I am learning that I do not know you as well as I thought I did either. I am trying to catch up. I said, good, David. Catch up. I am still here. Madison, I heard, moved back to Washington to live near her sister. She remarried within a year to a man who, by David's report through the grapevine of their mutual friends, was wealthier than David had been, and less independent. David said when he told me, Mom, I think she found the version of me she had wanted the whole time. A guy with more money and less spine. I said, David, do you feel bad about it? He said, Mom, I feel good about it. I feel good that she found what she wanted, and that I am not it. I said, that is a healthy way to think about it. He said, I have had some help thinking about it. I smiled. Our Sunday dinners became the center of my week. Every Sunday 4:30, David at the front door with a bottle of wine and some small thing he had brought. Sometimes the basil plant variety, sometimes a loaf of bread from a bakery in the city he had started going to, sometimes flowers. He had, in his second year after the divorce, started dating a woman named Priya who was an architect and who was, as far as I could tell, nothing like Madison in any respect. She was smaller and funnier and far less interested in hosting parties. She came to dinner at my house for the first time on the Sunday before Thanksgiving, and she arrived with David, and she shook my hand and said, Mrs. Whitfield, David has told me a lot about you. And I just want you to know that I understand this is your house and I am very glad to be here as your guest. I laughed. I said, Priya, that is a very specific sentence. Did David rehearse it with you? She said, yes, actually. He did. I laughed more. I said, well, that is charming of him. Come in. Call me Margaret. She was delightful. She did not try to reorganize anything. She did not comment on my cooking. She asked me about the photographs on the mantel. She asked about Henry. She asked about Rebecca. She asked about my teaching years. By the end of the dinner she had asked me more real questions about my life than Madison had asked in 3 years of living under my roof. David watched her with a kind of careful happiness, the happiness of a man who has found someone who makes his life larger instead of smaller. I thought, David, my son, you have learned. A year into dating Priya, David sat me down one Sunday and said, Mom, I want to ask you something. I said, David, all right. He said, I am thinking about asking Priya to marry me. I wanted to talk to you first. Not for permission. I am 49 years old. But because last time I did not talk to you first and I think I should have, and I am trying to do things differently. I said, David, that is a beautiful thing to say. He said, Mom, what do you think? I said, David, what I think is that Priya is a fine woman, and that you are a better man with her than I have seen you be with anyone, and that if you are asking me whether you should marry her, the answer depends on one thing I need to ask you. He said, What, Mom? I said, David, where are you going to live? He looked at me. He laughed. He said, Mom, we have been looking at houses. In the city. A small one. Priya has her own apartment, obviously, and I have mine. And we are thinking of buying something together. Not here. Not in this town. In the city, close to both of our work. I said, David, that is the right answer. I wanted to be sure. He said, Mom, I am not moving back into this house. Not ever. I want you to know that. I said, David, I know. He said, I know you know. I wanted to say it anyway. I said, Thank you, David, for saying it. He married Priya the following spring in a small ceremony at a courthouse with 12 people. I wore a blue dress. Rebecca flew in. The boys came. Priya's parents came from New Jersey, lovely people. Her father a retired pediatrician. Her mother a woman who taught Hindi at a community college. We had dinner afterward at a restaurant Priya had chosen, and at one point Priya's mother leaned over to me and said, Margaret, David has told us about the house and about the Sunday and about the 30 days. I want you to know that I admire you very much. I was surprised. I said, Oh, thank you. She said, Women of our generation, we are not always taught how to say what you said. It is a gift you have given David more than you know. My daughter is marrying the man you let him become. I took her hand across the table. I held it. I said, "Thank you for telling me that." She held my hand back. The house has changed since then. Not dramatically. I am not the kind of woman who renovates. But I have made small changes that are mine. I repainted the living room a soft pale green that Henry and I had always talked about, but had never done. I bought a new chair for the reading corner because Henry's old chair had finally given out, and I sat in the store for 2 hours until I found one that was the right height for my back. I put in a small bench by the front door, so that I would have somewhere to sit while I changed my shoes, because I had noticed that leaning against the wall to put on my shoes had begun to make my hip complain. I put in a railing along the back porch steps, a proper one, not the loose one David had fixed. I had a man come to reorganize the pantry because I wanted it the way I wanted it. I took Madison's cream leather chair to the donation center. I sold the standing mixer. I kept, for reasons I cannot quite explain, the lemon print. I put it in the guest bathroom downstairs. I see it when I wash my hands. I smile at it. It reminds me every time of what I am no longer willing to allow in my own house. Ruth and I began a Thursday ritual. We have breakfast together every Thursday morning at the diner on Route 9. Ruth is 83 now and she walks slower, but her mind is still a trap, and we have conversations about everything. We have talked over the last 4 years about our daughters, our sons, our dead husbands, our living grandchildren, our books, our doctors, the president, the neighborhood, and one Thursday inevitably about the spoon. Ruth said, "Margaret, if she had not taken that spoon, what would have happened?" I thought about it. I said, "Ruth, I think I would have kept waiting. I think I would have waited another year, maybe 2. The spoon was the thing that let me stop waiting. The spoon was a gift, in a way." Ruth laughed. She said, "Only a woman like you would call it a gift." I said, "Ruth, the truest gifts are often the ones we don't recognize at the time. Madison did not mean to give me my life back. But she did. I want to tell you one more thing, and then I will let the story end. Last Thanksgiving Rebecca came back with the boys, and David and Priya came, and Ruth came, and Ruth's daughter Linda came with her husband and their little girl who was 3, and my house was fuller than it had been for Thanksgiving since before Henry died. I cooked most of it. Priya helped. Rebecca helped. The boys set the table, and they set it the way I had taught them when they were here in June, with the salad forks on the correct side. We sat at my dining room table, which we had extended with the leaf I had not used in 10 years, and there were 13 of us, and I looked around the table at all of these people, some of them connected to me by blood, some of them connected to me by choice, and I thought about the Sunday 4 years earlier when I had sat at this same table and watched Madison serve my soup to guests I had been sent away from. I thought about the difference between that Sunday and this Thursday. I thought about the 2 years before the spoon, when I had been a polite stranger in my own dining room. I thought about how long I had waited and what I had almost lost, and what I had almost allowed myself to become. David stood up before we started eating. He had a glass of wine in his hand. He cleared his throat. He said, "I wanted to say something if you all don't mind. I wanted to make a toast. Mom, I am making a toast to you, and I hope you will let me." I said, "David, all right?" He said, "Mom, I want to thank you for this dinner, for this house, for everything you have done for me, which is more than I can name. But mostly, Mom, I want to thank you for the spoon." Everyone laughed. They had heard the story, most of them at some point, because it had become a small family legend. David went on, "Mom, for years ago you taught me something I should have learned a long time before. You taught me that love that does not defend itself is not love, it is habit. You taught me that silence in the face of unkindness is a kind of permission. You taught me that a mother's patience is not a resource to be used up. I was an ungrateful son, Mom. I was worse than ungrateful. I was absent. And you did the hardest thing a mother can do, which was to force me to choose. And you made the choice cost something so that I could not pretend it was free. Everything good in my life right now, Mom, is because you did that. Priya is here because you did that. This dinner is here because you did that. I am here because you did that. So I am raising my glass to you, Mom. To you, and to the spoon, and to the woman who knew what her worth was when the rest of us had forgotten." Everyone raised their glasses. They said, "To Margaret." They said it together, and their voices made a little chorus around my dining room table. And I sat at the head of the table in the chair that had been Henry's chair. And I smiled, and I did not cry because I had learned by then that tears were not the only way a woman of 77 shows love at her own table. I said, "Thank you, David. Thank you all. Now eat please while the turkey is still hot." After dinner, after the pie, after the boys had cleared the table and Priya had loaded the dishwasher and Ruth had fallen asleep in the wingback by the fire, I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark yard. David came in behind me. He said, "Mom, what are you thinking about?" I said, "David, I am thinking about a thing I realized a little while ago. I am thinking about how, when Madison took the spoon out of my hand, she thought she was taking something from me. And she was. She was taking my dignity in that moment. But what she did not understand was that the spoon was not the thing I needed. I am 77 years old. I have cooked 10,000 meals. I do not need a spoon to know how to feed the people I love. What I needed was to remember that the kitchen was mine. The spoon reminded me. She thought she was taking something. She was giving me back something I had almost forgotten I had. That is the funny part, David. Cruel people, when they are small enough, sometimes do you the accidental favor of reminding you who you are. I would not wish Madison on anyone, but I am almost grateful to her now, in a distant way, because she was the specific person who did the specific thing that woke me up. Your father used to say, "Margie, some lessons arrive in envelopes you would never have opened on purpose." That was what the spoon was. An envelope I would never have opened on purpose. But the letter inside was for me, and it was the letter I needed. David was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes, David." He said, "Are you happy?" I thought about the question. I thought about the last 4 years, which had contained more happiness than the 7 before them, but which had also contained grief and loneliness, and the slow hard work of learning how to be a woman alone in a house again after decades of being half of a pair, and then a quarter of a household. I thought about Henry, who was not here, and who would always not be here, and who would always also somehow be here, in the chair by the window and in the railing on the back porch and in the light in the living room at 4 in the afternoon. I thought about Rebecca, who was in Oregon raising her boys. I thought about David standing beside me at the window, a man who had, at 53, finally become a man I was proud of, because I had forced him to. I thought about Ruth asleep by the fire. I thought about the house, my house, quiet and full and mine. I said, "David, I am content," which is better than happy in my experience. Happiness comes and goes. Contentment is a house you build and then you live in. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Mom, that is a good answer." I said, "David, it is the only honest one I have." A few days later I sat at the dining room table with a fresh pot of tea, and I wrote a letter to Rebecca. I told her about Thanksgiving. I told her about David's toast. I told her what I had said to David at the kitchen window. And I told her one more thing because I thought she should know, because she was my daughter and because daughters deserve to know what their mothers are thinking in the quiet years. I wrote, "Rebecca, I have been thinking about the thing you said to me on the phone 7 years ago now, when I first told you about Madison. You said, 'Mom, don't let them forget whose house that is.' I did not act on that advice for a long time. I let them forget. I almost forgot myself. The truth, Rebecca, is that you knew what I needed to do before I knew it. You saw it from Oregon before I could see it from the chair by the window. I want to tell you now that your voice in my ear across 3,000 miles was one of the reasons I finally did the thing I did. Your voice and Ruth's, and eventually, when it was almost too late, my own. I want you to know that, Rebecca. I want you to know that mothers need their daughters to tell them the truth. Do not ever stop telling me the truth. I will do my best, in whatever years I have left, to deserve it. I love you. Your mother." I mailed the letter the next morning from the post office 2 towns over, because that had become my habit and I liked it. I drove home in the gray November light. I pulled into my driveway. I looked at my house, yellow and solid in the cold morning, the forsythia bare now but still standing. I got out of the car. I walked up the porch steps, which had a railing now, and did not wobble under my hand. I unlocked the front door with my key. I went inside. I hung up my coat. I went into the kitchen. The wooden spoon was on its hook on the side of the stove, exactly where Henry had put the hook in 1991, exactly where the spoon had always belonged. I took it down. I held it in my hand. I thought about the Sunday 4 years before when Madison had taken it from me, and about the evening I had hung it back on its hook, and about all the meals I had made with it since, and about all the meals I still intended to make. I put a pot of water on to boil. I was going to make soup. Tomato soup probably, because I had cans of San Marzanos in the pantry and basil on the windowsill, and because it was a gray afternoon and tomato soup is what the weather was asking for. I stood at the stove with the spoon in my hand. I was 77 years old. I was alone in my house. I was happy. I was content. I was home. And nobody was ever going to take the spoon out of my hand again. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who share it. If this one moved you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another woman the world underestimated. And we tell those stories here.